Raman, you're on?
I can hear you, Doc, but I can't see anything on the...
No, you have to turn on your video if you want.
I'm not sure how do I go about it.
On the bottom of the screen, you should see a start video. Are you in the laptop browser or are you in a phone?
I'm on the laptop browser.
Okay. Are you able to see the start video button there?
Yeah, I'm unable to, I'm clicking on it, but I'm unable to get that going. So which means that you can't see me, right?
No. It doesn't even look like your computer is recognizing the video. Normally, otherwise the video would show up.
Okay.
And it'll be crossed out. I'm seeing only the audio.
Yeah, I've got that start video button. I'm just clicking on it. It's got that slash against it, and it's not going.
Do you have slides to show? You have
No, I have
things
no
you want to
slides. Oh, so we can just do an audio. And,
okay, why don't you just go ahead with an audio if your video doesn't work?
okay, great.
When you joined in, did it give you an option join with video or something?
It asked me join with audio.
Yeah. For some reason, I think you blocked your video on your computer. None of the applications are able to reach it.
Okay. Okay. Fine. So then let's proceed this way. How are we doing?
I'm doing good. The recording is on, so it's all yours.
Great. All right. Hi, guys. Very briefly, there are 2-3 things that I wanted to talk about. Of course, give you guys an update on what has happened with me on the work front and the personal front. And then move on to basically 2 things. One is my current role, and specifically, I'm in the financial inclusion space. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And the second is I wanted to talk a little bit about my relatively newfound passion for history, and especially Indian history. So those are really the few things that I wanted to talk about. So let's start with what has happened to me in my life. I mean, if you skip lightly over my formative years, where I'm purportedly threw a stone at a neighbor and got whacked by my mother, and move on to the time I landed in IIM. And nothing much to show for my stint in IIM other than a dubious distinction of sleeping not through 1 exam but 2 exams, and eventually joined Standard Chartered out of IIM. So 87 we graduated. 87 to 96 I was in India with Standard Chartered. 96 to 2005 I was with Standard Chartered Singapore. 2005 to 2008 was my last stint in the Standard Chartered group. That was in Indonesia. And so I left the group as the chief risk officer of a joint venture bank in Indonesia. In 2008, I left the group. I joined a startup finance company, Greenfield Venture in the UAE. Spent about 9-10 years there as a founding chief risk officer, moved to another private sector bank in the UAE. And then finally, after about 22 years, landed up back in India to join what is called a small finance bank. And I will mention briefly about the concept of a small finance bank when I get into the segment on my current role. Family comprises a wife, 2 kids, and 2 dogs at the moment. The 2 kids have both graduated from the US, and one of them is already working. She lives in San Francisco and works in Oakland, and the other one is she just graduated a week ago, less than a week ago, and she will be working in Atlanta in about a month's time. The whole family is here with us for a holiday at the moment. So that's pretty much what has happened as far as my life is concerned over the last many years. Now let's spend a little bit of time on my current role, and more importantly, I think the kind of organization it is. There's a specific license called a small finance bank license, which the Reserve Bank has issued in India. And the whole concept of a small finance bank is to get more and more marginal people into the financial space. So it's financial inclusion. There have been multiple attempts at financial inclusion, including the cooperative banks, the urban cooperative banks, and so on. But eventually now the government and the Reserve Bank of India have come up with this concept of a small finance bank. The license is different from a universal bank. In a small finance bank, a certain portion of your assets, a much larger portion of your assets must be in priority sector lending. And the average ticket size will be much lower than it is for a universal bank. So that's pretty much what distinguishes a small finance bank from a universal bank. Having said that, there were about 10 institutions which were offered a small finance bank license. And one of the critical aspects which it's a difference between what I have ever done versus what I'm doing right now is the sheer scale. The number of customers that you handle in a small finance bank is significantly different. So at its peak, I think our bank used to handle about 5 million customers. And that's the scale we're talking about. If I compare, obviously, many of my previous stints were in city-states. So in Singapore, in Standard Chartered Bank, I think at its peak, we probably handled about 250,000 customers. In UAE, again, the numbers were similar, 200 to 250,000. In Indonesia, the scale was higher, but definitely nowhere compared to the scale that we are handling out here. So that's one big difference in terms of scale. The second big difference is obviously the kind of customers that you deal with. So microfinance lending is really the mainstay of the small finance banking license. So very briefly, how does a microfinance, and there's one product called the self-help group, the group loans. So how does it work? You have and this was popularized in the world by the Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus. So the model works in the sense that you have, and then lending is almost entirely geared towards women. The women get together and they stand guarantee for each other. Average ticket sizes are about, say, 40 to 75,000 rupees. Loans are repaid in, typically these are short tenor loans, no more than 24 months. Loans are repaid in monthly installments, and you have a bunch of collection people who go to a specific meeting center. So if there are 10 people, all 10 people belong to the same neighborhood. They come, get together in that meeting center. The collector goes and he has his handheld device. He obtains the biometrics of the customers, and then he obtains the payment as well. So that's really how this whole process works. And by and large, this had been working very well until there was a huge event shock, which was the demonetization. And that actually threw out of gear many companies, but much more than any other company, our company got affected pretty badly. And in the aftermath of demonetization, there were a couple of years of pretty significant losses. And when I say significant, it's really significant. Now, my joining, and the name of the company, incidentally, is Jana Small Finance Bank. So my joining Jana happened after the crisis had happened, and so demonetization was in November 16, and by December 17 is when I joined. And at that time, I mean, clearly the signs were very clearly visible. For me, the attraction was coming back to India and working in the Indian financial sector, but B, also the challenge of working as part of a turnaround. So I happened to get back here, and after that, I think it's been a challenging assignment. But the good thing is that the investors stood behind the company, and after 2 years of very significant losses, we now, month on month, we've started breaking even in terms of profit. So on the one hand, I think if I just look back at the 2 years, I think 2-3 items stand out in terms of the learnings, in terms of the experiences. One is being part of a turnaround. Second is working with this segment, and it's actually been a very very different experience from all the kind of customer bases that I had worked with. I worked with corporates. I'd worked in the retail segment, but nothing compares to the kind of customers that you deal with here. People who are generally not financially savvy at all, so pretty much part of your responsibility is to ensure that you are making them financially responsible, financially literate. All that is part of this experience. So that's largely what has happened in the last couple of years in my current role. Now, I mean, today, this is a bank which is pretty well capitalized. The investors have reposed a lot of faith and put in a lot of money. The amazing thing is also that in 2 years, actually less than 2 years, March 28th, 2018 was when we got our license to operate. And since then, now we are in a position to accept deposits. So the deposit numbers are pretty significant, in excess of 7,000 crores. And that's really the way and it's interesting. I mean, I heard Arvind talk about a turnaround. When in some ways, when you're living as part of a turnaround, you're able to see the building blocks. You're able to see what is working, what is not working. And in this case, it was also a transition from a NBFC, a non-banking finance company, to a bank. And so from the time when you were not in a position to take deposits to a time, and therefore all your funding was in the form of loans from term institutions. We've really come to a stage where term institution funding is replaced by deposits. It's been a pretty interesting journey. So that's the first segment that I wanted to talk about. Then let me move to the second segment, which is about my passion for history. Now, history is something which I used to hate, and I did talk about sleeping through an exam in my introductory remarks. So one of the exams I slept through was Indian economic and political history. I slept in the midterms, and I ended up with 9 on 40, and somehow managed to salvage an acceptable grade as part of the end terms. But subsequently, I mean, things have changed dramatically, to the extent that one of the trips that I made to India when I was living in Indonesia was specifically to look at all the ancient temples in Karnataka. So that was a time when I moved around first to Mysore, looked at Srirangapatna, and I was quite amazed at the the place where Tipu Sultan was killed is really one open yard with just a board which says that Tipu was killed here. So we don't seem to have a lot of understanding or concern about history. And I had been to Pearl Harbor once, and I mean, Pearl Harbor has a history of all of 70, 75 years. And I think we should learn from the Americans in terms of how to market our history. So they took us through a ship. There was a movie, and there was a submarine captain who was part of the original setup, and he gave us a lot of. He narrated a lot of incidents about what had happened and so on. This was I'm talking about having gone to Pearl Harbor about 20 years ago. I think there's a lot to learn from the Americans in terms of how to project our history and culture. And I was a little disappointed to see how Tipu Sultan's the place of death was maintained. But having said that, I think the Archaeological Society of India is doing a tremendous job. We went to Belur, Alibidu, and Shravanabelagola, and this ASI guide whom we had hired was so knowledgeable. He was able to take us through what was happening, and I mean, there was in particular there was this Ganesha with a stove pressed against the ground, and the architecture was showing splits on the stone, and he was able to explain that very nicely to us. There was also just before you enter the temple, outside the temple on the walls, you have depictions of sexual congress as well, including fellatio. And the ASI guide was explaining that temples were used as places of learning for people, and so including how to live life after brahmacharya as a grahastha. So those were the kind of things that there's so much culture and knowledge available, and the ASI guides are very well informed. I just wish that we could do a much better job of marketing India, Indian history, Indian culture. A couple of other examples of history and what I picked up from them. I'd lived in Chennai all my life, and I knew of Ice House. There was a bus which would take you to Ice House, which subsequently became known as Vivekananda Illam or Vivekananda House. I didn't know what that building was. I'd lived in Chennai for at least about 15 years. Recently, I had visited Chennai and actually spent a little bit of time in going around Chennai. And I figured out that Ice House was where blocks of ice would be imported from Boston, including apparently from Thoreau's Walden Pond, and kept there because the British officers needed to cool their drinks in the sweltering heat. And this was before refrigeration had been discovered. So it was very fascinating to figure out that that's what Ice House was all about. Subsequently, Vivekananda, after his Parliament of Religions in Chicago, he landed via Sri Lanka, he landed in Chennai, and that's where he stayed. So that's why it's called the Vivekananda Illam. And it has subsequently become converted into a museum and a meditation hall of sorts. So that's one part of it. I visited the Indian Museum, the Madras Museum, and a couple of things really fascinated me there. There's one place where you have a lot of Nataraja statues. Everywhere, it's only the left leg which is raised. And then I figured out that there's one which has a right leg raised, which is very different. And apparently there are only a couple of places where you have Nataraja in this pose, including in Madurai. So that's one more piece of history that I picked up. I visited Fort St. George. I'd been driving past Fort St. George every day for many, many years when I was working in Stanchart, Madras. I knew that it housed the secretariat in those days, but never really bothered to figure out what was happening there. Visited Fort St. George, and I found that it has a lot of history, including a church there where the first person to get married there was Elihu Yale, who apparently is the founder of Yale University. And founder meaning he donated about 32 books worth about 800 pounds. The other piece of information that I picked up was Yale had a very unsavory reputation, including having been suspended, terminated from East India Company for misappropriation. So very interesting snippets that I picked up. I saw the flag which was hoisted on Independence Day. So I would really, there's one reason I probably, it wasn't a very conscious choice of me to have come back to India. But I do believe that there's a lot I would want to explore in terms of furthering my understanding of what's happening in this country. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about, guys. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Hello?
Yeah. Raman, it was really nice. This is Rajiv here. It was really good to hear about your journey and your recent realization about the role of architecture, culture, and history. We'll come to that. But just going back to the work part, couple of things which always intrigues me is this microfinance, that particular model itself. And I believe you don't accept deposits, right? Your model works completely on the lending rates and the interest that you earn.
No, we as a bank, we do accept deposits.
Okay.
But typically the person who deposits with us is different from the person who borrows from us.
Okay, right. Okay. So then in terms of the old model, and you talked about the crisis which came in 2016 with the demonetization, but there was an earlier crisis which wiped out some of the most hoary, big ones like Basics all got wiped out virtually in that earlier, Holocaust which happened. And even that Vikramakula's company, I forget that company's name.
Yeah.
But so looking at that, this model where, the effective rate of interest today that a small borrower is paying, what would be the effective rate today? And is there a way to make, first, what is effective rate, Raman? And is there through a model of technology which bypasses the bill collector, the whole process, right? How low do you conceive that rate of lending to come down to? Because in early days, I remember hearing things like even 3% a month being charged, etc.
Oh, sure. Okay.
The model which is inherently unjust.
Fair enough. Okay. So two things. One is I think 3% a month is out of the window. But having said that, I think the alternatives for this group of customers is the moneylender, who sometimes charge as much as 10% per month. But today's effective rate in the microfinance segment is anywhere between 18 and 24%. Now, do I believe that there is a lot of room for it to come down? Much below 18%, I don't know if there is room to come down, because if I look at many of these microfinance institutions, their access to borrowings is probably at somewhere in the region of 8 to 10%. So as you become an established bank like Bandhan Bank, and you are able to obtain current and savings accounts, which brings down your effective cost of funds, maybe your effective cost of funds will come down to 7-8%. So there is cost of funds, there is cost of servicing and cost of operation.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But so if you have a payment mechanism. So, and some of the payment mechanisms being explored are usage of QR codes and so on. You will be able to bypass a lot of the human intensity which is involved in the collections at the moment. But even then, I don't believe that your cost of operations can come down anything less than 6-7%. And so if I load an 8-odd% with a 6-7% and then keep some for profit margins, you're really not looking at anything much less than 18%, in my opinion.
Okay, got it. So
just one continuing question on that, Raman.
Go ahead.
The spread you are looking at between cost of capital and lending is somewhere around 10%. And is that and 8 to 10%? And is that consistent with what you experienced in Standard Chart and others? And if not,
the way I would look at it, Doc, is ultimately, if I look at shareholders wanting a 20% return on capital, and the capital adequacy ratio for this group of banks is about 15%, then you're looking at a 3% return on assets. That's largely what you're looking at. So that's why so 3% return on assets. So I said, let's say cost of funds is around 8 to 9%. Operating cost is at about 7%. And then you add your return on assets required of 3%. So that's how the pricing would work.
Right. So what I'm saying is what Rajiv was asking, through technology and other mechanisms, can the processing fee be significantly reduced? And
so
and
6 to 7%.
See a way there, or you're kind of saying, no, that's not very likely to happen in the near future?
Below 6 to 7%, in my opinion, is not likely.
Okay. Because you have the experience of seeing the large bank as well as a small bank. That's right. It's an interesting experience. Okay. And one other thing, you said demonetization kind of wiped things out. And I would have thought that demonetization would have driven the demand for more of these kind of borrowings, so that the small business and what they do, this is probably the person who is buying a cow with it or trying to run a small shop, that they would be the ones looking for money.
See, fundamentally what happened during demonetization or just the aftermath of demonetization is there was a lot of confusion as to whether to accept old notes, yes, no. And the government was not very clear in terms of, or the RBI was not very clear in terms of the policies. And so a lot of, some of the banks were accepting the old notes. And I think Janalakshmi, as it was, Janalakshmi Financial Services, decided not to accept the old notes. And so there was a period when there was a lot of confusion about, because all of collection is cash collection. Once a month, you have a predetermined date where you go to the customer's meeting center, the customers gather and they give you the cash. And you you take the biometric, you have a handle device with a printer, you cut the receipt and give it to them. And that's how the model was working. Just the aftermath of demonetization, I think for about 3-4 months, there was almost paralysis in terms of the collection activity. And I think once for this group of customers, you need to make sure that, and it's not just this group of customers, any group of customers, if they are in the habit of paying regularly, then everything is fine. The moment there is a hiatus, then it becomes very difficult to recover from that. So that's really what happened in this.
Okay. So it was more of that. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. So on your journey with all history, what does kind of future look like? I mean, it was interesting tidbits that you provided. What does it? Where does it take you next, or what do you think of yourself doing in the next 5 years or so?
I really don't know the answer to that. Unfortunately, in these 2 years have kept me so busy that I haven't been able to do any further explorations. But I certainly would want to do something. And one of the things I've been toying with, and nothing concrete at the moment, is can I set up a tourism venture, so to speak, which is a boutique tourism venture, which takes people to places of historical interest, a separate tour for these people, was one of the things that I was toying with. Nothing concrete at the moment, but let's see where life takes me.
Okay, because there are societies that have been formed, and there is one in Chennai, for example, which does historical collection
Yeah.
and things like that.
Oh, great.
So there may be similar ones that you can do in Bangalore where you are, and so on.
Sure.
Which the challenge, at least what you are pointing out, that this ISI guide seem to know a lot.
ISI has different connotations.
The ASI,
Yeah.
Archaeologist Surveyor, yeah. So the ASI guide seemed to know. The thing, at least in my experience, I have found was that the ASI guides seem to say a story which is reasonably plausible when you hear it, but doesn't seem to match up with things when you leave them.
Okay.
And so the thing is, the larger narrative doesn't fit into the minor narrative. And then if there is a way to solve that out, that would be great.
Oh, that's an interesting observation.
Yeah. So, for example, if you say something like this temples were this, there is not a larger narrative that talks about how it was and how temples evolved and what were done there and what was a typical behavior. So if there is a macro experience and then you see the micro, then you say, oh yeah, in this temple this happened.
I understand. No, in fact, as part of that trip, there was Belur, there was Halipet, there was Somnath Pura, I think. And in Somnath Pura, you had an open piece of land where there were a lot of sculptures with a hand hacked and a head hacked and so on. And they were able to tell me that this was Alauddin Khilji and his marauding army headed all the way to Madurai. And that's when they, as part of their zealousness, because idol worship was obviously not allowed in Islam, they really created mayhem there. But yes, you're right. I think you are. So the ASI guy is able to give you some perspectives on where it fits in historically, but I think you're right. You need to put it in a slightly different context as well, and get a better handle on what's happening.
Okay. Raman, I just want to step back for a second into the professional before coming back to the personal. So when you look at this model of microfinance, the technology backbone that you put in place, there are independent companies only looking at money transfer from the same audience, daily wage laborers working overseas, working in India in different parts, migrant labor, and, money transfer of cash, etc. So do you see that model riding any other model, complementary model riding on your existing technology backbone, extending to a new class of customers so that, again, you're able to bring down cost? Because whatever one might say, 18%, 24%, I understand your constraints, but is there no other way to expand the lending base and bring down cost of operations over it so that you spread your central overheads over a larger base and bring down effective cost of lending?
See, actually, I mean, there are three components which go into the cost of lending, right? One is cost of funds.
You told that.
Cost of funds can only come down when you have a large base of current and savings accounts. And I don't believe that even for established banks, the cost of funds can come down anywhere below 5-6%.
Right.
So I think each of these three components we need to.
The in-between component, each of these components, The
expenses, I think with more mechanization, more automation, you probably can bring it down to about 4-5%. But I mean, like I said, anything below 4-5% doesn't seem very likely to my mind. So
you don't see the MFC industry in India targeting something like 12% in the ostensible in the near term? You don't see the next 3 to 5 years.
Sorry,
12%.
Did you say MSC industry or
the microfinance? The banks. All the microfinance banks who are there. Right. So all of them, do they target? Okay, eventually I need to get to 12%. Is there an incentive to get to a 12% at some point, or just say anyway the market can bear this, so let me go at this rate?
No, it's not about what the market can bear as much as this. Is the other thing about microfinance inherently is your loss norms. I mean, in all the calculations that I gave you, I didn't assume any losses.
Right.
But losses typically can go to about 2% on a mean. But there is so much volatility in this segment. You yourself gave the example of SKS. And then I can give you the own example, our own bank as an example. There's so much loss volatility that pricing needs to take some element of cognizance over the loss volatility. So 12%, in my opinion, is unrealizable for this segment. 12% for the larger SME borrower who's borrowing against a collateral of property, I think is doable. In fact, the market operates for this segment at about anywhere between 10.5% and 14% for a relatively large loan. But for the smaller loans, in my opinion, I think 12% looks unlikely.
Okay. On a different note, going on the same theme that Doc told about the next 5 years, but in a different way, over the last so many years that you've been, traveling through multiple countries,
right?
What has kept you occupied, apart from work? What are your other interests that you've talked about 2 dogs, but what else have you been engaged in?
Okay. I do like traveling, and Indonesia was one of the places I really loved. Indonesia has a lot of history as well.
Yes.
In fact, Indonesia in some ways was a colony with invasions, in a manner of speaking, from South India. Rajaraja Soren did go there, and so there's a lot of actually, even before those times, there's a lot of Hindu influence in Indonesia. So I visited. There is this Prambanan temple in central Java, and that's supposed to be, other than Pushkar, probably one of the few places in the world where there is a temple for Brahma. It's no longer an operational temple, but and then there in that same temple you had a statue of somebody who's called Shivaguru, whom I figured out was Agastya. So Agastya obviously means that there's a lot of southern influence, South Indian influence in Indonesia. So stuff like that. That's one part of it. Second part of it is thanks to my girls being in the US, we've been to US many times, and what we typically do is we take a car and do parts of the US which are relatively unexplored, and we have a lot of fun during this period. So that's something that I do, and otherwise, and I try and capture some of these as travelogues, so to speak, which I mean, really, it's at the moment for my own consumption. I've just write it because I like writing about it. So that's
you should share that, Raman. Just like Doc published the photographs from his recent treks.
Right.
It'll be nice that you should share those travelogues. It'll be nice to read.
Sure.
One other thing on the the tour guides and the fact that we don't preserve our monuments. One thing which really stood out was Shankaracharya's, one of the greatest Indians in history. His dying place, if you were to go where he died, and he's said to have been cremated or buried, I think he's buried as a sannyasi, is in Oli, which is Joshimath. Okay. And it's a complete nondescript place. Nobody even knows about it. And while the mutts are thriving, the place where the founder is, but people don't know that this is the place. But the larger point about guides and other things and the experiential tourism, there are lots of companies, Raman. It's a very interesting area, but curated tours and with select audiences have been really there. Quite a lot of them in different parts of the country, historic, even, people who take you on river tourism. So you follow a river, the path of a river and communities along the river. So very interesting ideas are there, but it's a very interesting place to be, what you are thinking of. So.
Yeah, I mean, talking of Shankaracharya, I did visit Kaladi, which is supposed to be the birthplace. I was quite, again,
taken aback.
There's a lot more which can be done to preserve the place, but I think they did a pretty decent job there.
Well, actually, it's just that one building, and Doc, I don't know if whether you've seen the place. They've done very little justice to what Shankaracharya has really done. But anyway, so
Yeah, that's interesting experience, and we wish you can capture more of your trips, as Rajiv said, and share them in blogs, travelogues, however that may be.
Sure.
So we, some of us can,
and
who
just
don't
one
actually
more
travel to
thought
these
which
places,
came
can
to me,
vicariously
Raman.
look at them.
Yeah, sorry, Doc. Yeah, so just one more thought which came. This set of life choices that you made, Raman. Growing up in Chennai and then traveling outside the world. In fact, a big chunk of your career has been outside the country.
Mm-hmm.
So, what really has been your overall sense of those choices? Going to Indonesia, then Dubai, and then traveling the US. So the totality of that. How did you weigh those choices? And when you look back, right, would you do something differently, or you're absolutely happy with the choices you made? And I'm not talking about professional, personal choices as much as the choice of living in India, going out, and so on.
See, I think when you're in your late 20s, early 30s, pretty much everybody wants to go out of India. And I was no different. And Singapore actually was a very attractive choice as a place to live in, other than professionally. So Singapore was a natural thing to do. And having spent about 10 years, when this opportunity came from Indonesia, I think one of the things is, I've been very fortunate that my family has usually been all right with some of these decisions. My wife used to work in Citibank, but she gave up a job in Singapore when my older kid was about 8 years old. And thereafter, she was reasonably flexible in terms of places. So when Indonesia came up as an opportunity, it was almost, other than the girls who loved Singapore at that time, they were relatively young. It was almost a unanimous decision to go there. And again, there are no regrets at all. I think it was a place rich in culture, rich in history. From Indonesia to Dubai was a major transition. Mm-hmm. Because you are moving from Southeast Asia to Middle East. You are moving from a place which is relatively steeped in culture and history to a place which is generally a more modern city. And so there was a little bit of a struggle in making that choice. But having made that choice, again, no regrets, because I think Dubai has turned out to be a very good experience in a different way. It's an example of how a city in a desert, they can actually they can actually create something out of pretty much nothing. And tall skyscrapers, 6-lane highways, an efficient mechanism of government. So if you go to any, I just came back from Dubai 2-3 days back on my way back from Atlanta, and spent some time there trying to renew my visa. I was amazed at the way the government was working. Within 24 hours, I managed to pretty much get all my work done there. So that's an example of how things have turned out well. So to go back to your question, any regrets whatsoever at all? None whatsoever.
No. Not so much the regrets part, but in terms of how's the choices you made, what you weighed, and how you did. So you did cover that, Raman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then coming back to India again. There was a time when I was actively looking to come back to India. That was when my mother was unwell. Unfortunately, she passed on. So the immediate pressure receded. But having said that, and India, for some reason, always seemed to be on the cards. There were at least 2 job opportunities that I had within the Standard Chartered Group first, which somehow didn't work out. There was one towards somewhere 2001 or so. There was one again in 2004 or 2005. So for some reason, it's not that I was hankering to come back to India, but there was always an openness to come back to India. And so when this job opportunity came, there was only one thing at the back of my mind, which potentially could have prevented me from coming. That was the fact that I had been in the current company for just about a year or so, a year and a quarter. But having said that, finally, when I saw what was available, I think the choice was made. And I also, in some ways, having been the beneficiary of a hugely subsidized
Yes.
graduate's education, which at that time I couldn't even afford, and I had to take a bank loan to see my way through business school.
Yes.
It was, in some ways, I saw it as a way to pay back the country. So,
Wonderful.
if nothing else, in terms of the taxation, because I was coming from a zero tax rate to a 34% tax rate. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, you're serving a very vulnerable segment of the population, so that really is,
Right.
fulfilling, Raman.
So, in closing, one controversial question, and feel free not to answer it if you don't want to.
Okay.
Having what you mentioned about Dubai and other things, you have an opinion on it's better to have an authoritarian monarchy that does things efficiently instead of a vacuous democracy. And feel free to say no comment, so that's fine too.
The honest answer is I don't know, because I've seen things work very well there. I mean, right now I'm in the midst of chaos because of the citizenship amendment bill. So I mean, to be honest, I'm unable to decide one way or the other which is better. And I've seen a lot of the Catch-22 forums. I've seen a lot of debate on this, but I'm unable to figure out whether it is better to have a free-flowing democracy with all its complications, or clearly from an efficiency standpoint, I think there's no question. I think if it is, and even India has examples of this during the time of emergency. The things were working much better from an efficiency standpoint than that at any point in time subsequently. So efficiency, I don't think there is a question, and China has demonstrated that as well multiple times. But which one is a better model? I don't know the answer to that.
Hey, Doc, I have a question for you. When you're referring to raucous democracy, are you talking about the US or about India?
Either way, the thing is, my entire life experience is only these two places. And so I have never lived or spent any significant time in a non-vacuous democracy. So, which is why, since Raman had that experience, I was curious to know if he had an opinion on it. And especially because he works in a regulated industry, he can see the impact of some of those things directly there.
Yeah.
Now, Indonesia also, I mean, there was rocks stability during Suharto's time. And then things kind of unraveled after that. It's difficult for me to say. Obviously, the pre-Suharto time was economic stability. Now there is a lot less economic stability, but there's a lot more political freedom.
There's a lot more political stability with the current president.
Well, right now, yes. But
yes.
Prior to this, there was a lot of political instability as well, multiple changes.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Yeah, fair enough. That's okay. I don't have anything else. Rajiv, anything else, or we can wrap this up?
So, Raman, good. And, wish you well in your, in making Jana Bank really the force in this particular sector impacting people's lives. And of course, you're close by. We'll be meeting sooner than later. So look forward to that.
All right.
Yep.
Thanks.
And same, Raman. Look forward to meeting you again some point and spending some quality time.
All right. Thanks, Doc. Thanks, Rajiv. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye.